This video we're going to explore a few of the basic Python data objects. In particular, we're going to look at some of the numeric data objects that are available in Python. Python includes a number of different kinds of numeric data objects. The two that we're going to look at are the integers and the floating point numbers. Those are probably the two numeric objects that you will use most often. I think to explore integers and floating point numbers, the easiest thing to do is once again just to bring up the Python shell. And so here we already have the shell open. And I think most people have a pretty good idea of what an integer is and what a floating point number is, but it's probably important to talk about the difference and then to look at some things that are important with respect to how Python is going to require us to work with integers versus floating point numbers. Some of these things will also come up later when we talk about things like arithmetic operators and parameter passing and function returns and so on, but that's for another lesson. So let's start off and talk about the integers. The integers are basically the whole numbers, the positive and negative counting numbers, the numbers that don't have any fractional part. So for example, 34 is an integer and 65 is an integer and negative 23 is an integer and 0 is an integer. And one of the things that we can do in Python is we can ask a particular data object what kind of thing it is. And the way we do that is by using the type function. So for example, if I say type and I give it a particular object, in this case maybe I say the numeric data object 65, when I hit return, notice it says that this is a class int. So the integers in Python are called int. Now the floating point numbers are those numbers that have a fractional part, or if we're thinking about base 10, that would be the numbers that have a decimal point in them. So for example, 4.5 would be an example of a floating point number. And if we ask what is the type of 4.5, then what we're going to find is that it says the class is float. So in Python, the names of the numeric data objects, the classes that those objects belong to, we have either int or we have float. And we typically refer to those as the integers and the floating point numbers. Now, sometimes we want to be able to convert back and forth between integers and floating point numbers, and there are a couple of easy ways to do that. The first thing you can do is if you want to convert an integer to a floating point number, if you're simply talking about a literal, like for example 34, all you have to do is put a 0.0 after it and you will end up with the floating point equivalent. However, if you're working with an expression that's going to evaluate or a variable that is referring to a piece of data, you might want to have to convert that integer into a floating point. You can't just add a 0.0, so we can use a conversion function. We can say, I would like to convert to a float, and we can say 34. So this is going to say, take 34 and convert it to a float, and the result is 34.0. Likewise, we can go the opposite direction. We can say, let's take the floating point number 3.5 and I would like to convert that into an integer. Well, now we've got a problem because an integer can't have any fractional part. So basically we're going to have to get rid of the fractional part, and the way that this conversion is going to happen is that we're simply going to chop off all the fractional part and be left only with the integer part. So 3.5 is going to become 3. Now as we did before, there's a function that allows me to do this. I can say int 3.5 and this function will return 3. So int of 34.574837 is going to chop off all the fractional part, and notice that this is not a rounding exercise, 34.999999. If I int that, I still get 34. It truly chops off that fractional part. So float as a function converts an integer into a floating point number. An int as a function takes a floating point number and converts it back into an integer.